Yep, so we had a fairy godfather turn up in the form of Gough Whitlam, so...
Well, it certainly was. It was almost magical. It meant that my threat of immediate imprisonment disappeared completely. Like that, with the fairy godfather. I got swept to power and my conviction was quashed, which meant that I wasn't going to prison. And with Carol so soon to expect the birth of our first baby, Matthew, it was an enormous relief to us.
So what was the procedure? How did it actually happen? Presumably you had to go back into court, or what was the situation?
Well, it was actually a lot simpler than that. We simply received in the mail a letter saying that my conviction had been quashed and that I would not be facing any further charges. So I was a free man to continue my life.
So Pat, tell me, how did you make the transition from being a teacher to a full-time songwriter?
Well, where it became a professional thing, again, was another one of those incredible coincidences. Like, I had been teaching for a little while and I decided that eventually I'd buy myself a proper electric guitar and everything, you know. So I went into the city one night after I'd been teaching to Harry Landis's music shop, Harry Landis Music Shop in Lisbon. And it was before the era of mobile phones. I had a house phone, but my friend Bob Wood, rang me at the store. He'd rung my wife Carol at our home in Lidcombe, and he rang me at the store and they put me on the phone to him. And they said, he said, I heard you in the city. And I said, yes, I am. He said, there's a really, really good singer-songwriter who's playing tonight in Forbes Street, Woolloomooloo, at a little place called the Journey's End. You've got to see him. I'm not allowed to tell you. Paul tells me I'm not allowed to tell you who it was. But I said, all right. No one had heard of him at the time and he hadn't been recording anything. But he was supposed to be a really good singer-songwriter. I said, okay, well, I'll come and see him. So I drove out of the city up to Forbes Street, Woolloomooloo, and it was like the place I'd grown up in. It was an old tenement, 2 stories high. And I went inside and the place was packed. All these people had obviously heard about this guy and they wanted to see him. So we waited. And I had my new guitar with me and the amplifier I'd taken in to try it out. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited. But the singer-songwriter from Melbourne got lost and couldn't find the joint. Around about half an hour after everyone was sitting there looking around, I suddenly got a tap on my shoulder from my friend Bob. He said, guess what, mate? I said, what? He said, I told the boss you got your guitar and your amplifier, you're on. I said, what? And he said, you're on. He said, I got you $25. I'd never heard of $25 all in one place, as I did on that night. September 26, 1976. I did the show and it was such a huge success they insisted I come back and keep playing there. And I did. By the end of that year, I was doing 6 shows a week in Sydney and trying to teach at the same time. My song Another Weekend of the first album that we released, that tells a story about what it's like to be a teacher with all the out of school hours work you have to do in preparation and trying to do what you love at the same time. But thankfully, again, things were very different. I was allowed to take 3 years leave of absence which I did, by which time I was allowed to resign. And I had to, because I could no longer go on teaching. My career had taken off in such an enormous way. Out of folk music into folk rock and into pub scene in Sydney, which in so many ways was so open to developing new talent at the time. So I was rotating around the pubs. It was me, there was In Excess, there was Dragon, there was all sorts of people that all over the place at that time for the next 10, 12, 15 years that I worked mainly in the pub scene in Sydney. It was so supportive of independent music. It was so supportive of people building crowds and making their living out of their work, their passion for what they did. I feel sorry for younger people these days who, since those family hotels were all taken over by many of the big corporations and turned into nothing but gambling dens filled with poker machines. It's so hard for young musicians these days to earn their living the way I did. It was an exceptionally blessed time for me, and that's where it went until things changed amazingly at the end of the 1980s and led me into a whole different way of performing. Well, the Chippendale song certainly got played like crazy, and because of that there was a great push among my fans who were beginning to come to my shows in very large numbers for me to release an album. By this stage something else significant happened. Another singer-songwriter by the name of Trevor Knight contacted me and told me that I should be playing on the North Shore as well as in the city. I had never really been over that side of the harbour to play, but he told me there was this little venue called Dr. Redbird's Medicinal Inn on the corner of Mountain Walker Street in North Sydney. It was a little wine bar, and I went over and started playing there. That led to a huge rise in my followings on the North Shore, and really significantly, within 6 months, I got asked to go and play at a venue called the Rest Hotel, an old-fashioned pub down in Milson's Point. I started playing there, and the sheer number of fans that kept turning up at that place was enormous. This is the whole pub rock scene of the 1970s and 80s that grew up and gave birth to all the bands like Dragon and In Excess and all those people. Suddenly I was part of that scene in a very huge way. And when my song was starting to be played quite heavily, there was a huge push by my fans to release an entire LP. So, one of my fans happened to be a person who worked at CBS's pressing factory, and he went to his boss and asked if I would be allowed to be the first artist that was able to use their presses to create his own independent album. So I put together my first album called What You See Is What You Get. And it was unbelievably at a time when to produce an album or to press an album you had to make a minimum of 5,000 copies. I had no idea how long it would take me to sell all those copies, but I went ahead with that. I'll never forget the night that they arrived at our house at Lidcombe. truck rolled up, and when they unpacked the truck, 5,000 albums filled up half the house. They were in every corner and nook and cranny in our house at Yarram Street.
These would have been 12-inch vinyl LPs?
Absolutely. What you see is what you get. And I've still got copies of them. And we started selling them at our gigs. But at the same time, again, the television became interested in this phenomenon, and so they started putting me on their current affairs shows, and that led to places like David Jones agreeing that they would stock my albums in their retail outlets. I was overwhelmed. It started me off in a completely different track where I had to form my own record label, which we called Shoestring Productions.
Okay, Pat, so your career is taking off, but you were still teaching, I believe. So obviously you had a bit of a conflict there eventually. How did that all turn out?
Well, one of the songs on What You See Is What You Get, the album, was called Another Weekend, about a teacher trying to do all those things at the same time as pursuing his dreams. And that was one of the songs that my crowd became very fond of. But it did mirror the fact that the pressure was on me at that time to choose one career or the other, and to the other one to just be a part-time interest. Well, thankfully, with my loving wife Carol's support, I was enabled to make that decision. She supported me in making the decision, and she wasn't working. She was our mother of our first child, stay-at-home mum, and yet she gave me her permission to follow my dream.
So this could have been fairly exciting financially at the time, one way or the other.
Yes, but Carol's always been the person who was the rock-solid bedrock of our relationship. She was sure by that stage that my income could be managed and balanced. And she was right. I was now starting to earn extraordinary amounts of money, even for that time. And for the late 1980s, I think at one stage I was earning $720 a night at the Rest Hotel, which was a lot of money at that stage. So Carol was balancing and measuring the money, and we both knew it could suddenly stop at any moment, but we pursued it. My crowd really solidified, and it became almost like a family. The Rest Hotel, people have said that over and over again. It became a place where the crowd would turn up in huge numbers. They were gradually learning all my original songs as well as the covers songs that I would sing at the time to get them all sing along, to the point that they had their own rehearsed parts. And they were more the show than I was. They also developed all these strange traditions. Because they couldn't get to the bar, when you had so many people in the pub that only was supposed to hold 350 people, it was absolutely chock-a-block. They couldn't move hardly from where they were. So they began a tradition of passing money to the person next to them to go right across the top of the crowd to the bar with a piece of paper ordering the drinks, and then the drinks would come back with the change, and the crowd would return the change to the person that sent it. It became this incredible tradition, and people started saying it was more like a family than a rock and roll crowd.
So how many people would you have had in that venue?
I would say the record number, the night we recorded the Live at the Rest Hotel album, they say it was up to 2,500 people and that meant they were all on the streets outside, surrounding and inside, but it didn't matter. They all knew the parts that they had to sing and they had to do. I'm told by Glenn A. Baker that it was us that invented crowd surfing in Australia. Well, I had no idea. I had never thought of it as crowd surfing, but one of the things I started doing was I did a set of parodies of television themes and advertisements, sending up the advertisement in the television industry at the time. And one of my favourite shows when I was a child, living at McGregor Street, was Astro Boy. We used to hurry home from school, climb through the back windows because Mum was off at work, and watch Astro Boy. Well, one night when we were doing these parodies of the television themes and television shows, everyone had their hands up in the air, you know, shaking their hands and singing the song. So I don't know what made me do it. Maybe my nutty brother Ronaldo. But I leapt out onto the crowd because they had their hands up in the air being Astro Boy, and they surfed me right around the room and back, which was quite extraordinary. And as I say, this incredible thing of community between them was overwhelming. I'll never forget one night that one lady got her Christmas wages, and they came in and she put a bag down on the ground, and somebody stole her bag with her wages. When I told the crowd what had happened, they all started to search the floors and around the area, and someone found her bag in the facility, and they brought it back and gave it to me, but the money was gone. I told the crowd what had happened, and so we took the bag and sent it round the room. It filled up with money 3 times the amount of what she'd lost. The crowd really viewed themselves as a family, and it was their show. And a lot of the other acts at the time, some of the big name bands and that, were starting to say the same things. The Little River Band and all that were all saying that their crowd were becoming the show. They were as much a part of the show as I was, to the point that one night, incredibly, somebody bought a house less than 250 yards away from the Rest Hotel, and they rang the police and complained about the noise. And because there was confusion about the regulations at the time, the police came round and they came in and they told me that I'd have to stop singing. So I said, all right. And I turned around to the crowd and I told them that I was going to have to go so they could start the Pat Drumond Remedial School of Background Singing. I gave them one chord and a start, and they sang for 25 minutes so loud the police were outraged, and they told me I'd have to stop them. I said, I can't stop them, you have to. So eventually the police left quite overwhelmed. But that was kind of strange too, because very often the police were in the audience, members of the force in North Sydney, singing along at the top of their voices. So it was an extraordinary time when, right across the Australian rock industry, the crowd became as much a part of the show as the performer.
So you were the golden-haired boy of the proprietors of the pub at the time, no doubt.
I was. And then something sort of tragic happened. Alan Bond, famous in many ways for being an Australian hero for getting us the America's Cup, famous for being a golden hero for many Australians because he got us the America's Cup, share rated Tui's, and he found a clause in the way that Tui's ran their pubs. Tui's used to sell the leasehold, the business, to their proprietors who would run the pub and make the profit out of it. And many of them, like the Rest Hotel, built up enormously and were worth a real lot of money. When Bond took over Tui's, he found a small chink in the lease that allowed him to simply evict the publicans who owned the business.
What, even though they owned the freehold?
They'd leased the freehold.
Oh, I see, yes.
But he found a chink in it, and I'm told that it was one that was originally put in place to be able to get rid of alcoholic publicans. All he had to do was simply evict them, and that was the end of their leasehold. Well, he came to the publicans at the Rest Hotel and told them that he was going to evict them.
How many years after you started there did this go on?
It's going on for 10 years there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd already been very blessed by a set of publicans that were there, in that at one stage they came to me after they'd taken over the leasehold from a previous lot of publicans and said to me, "We want you to guarantee you're going to stay here." And I said, "Well, I can't guarantee that I'm going to stay here, but once every 3 months I take tenders, and if you match the best tenders you will always have the priority and I will stay with you." And I have been here a long time now.
How many nights a week were you playing there?
At the Rest Hotel, only one night a week.
Mm-hmm.
I was working in all the other venues around Sydney and North Sydney by that stage. But the publicans said to me, "Well, I've been talking to the North Shore boys and they tell me that you're a bit of a Westie and you don't own your own house." I said, "No, I don't. We rent." By this stage we were renting in Abbotsford, a pretty ritzy apartment down on the harbour. But the idea of owning a house, coming up with a deposit, was enormous for us. We hadn't thought about that. He said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give you enough money to put down as a deposit on a house, but you have to stay here and work until you've paid it off." And as I've said to you, I was earning about $720 a night at that stage. So I took the offer of the money that they gave us in consultation with Carol, and we decided to buy a house. We couldn't afford one in Sydney, but we bought a house in Megalong Street, Leura, for $39,000. If you told that to children these days, they wouldn't believe it was possible. I think in recent times it's sold for something like $2.4 million. And it was a lovely old brick home, which we renovated and did up over the years. I stayed at the Rest Hotel, and then, as I've told you, the publicans were dispossessed. Bond threw them out.